Hey, welcome everyone to this 24th version of EU Tech Policy Briefing. My name is Juan I'm a former colleague of Sebastian, and Sebastian, let me congratulate you for those 24 versions. So I'm here to give you an opportunity to provide updates, news, relay questions from policy peers on your previous newsletter. So let me start off with a question. How do you react to the rehabilitation of Mythos?
So the rehabilitation of Mythos doesn't come as a surprise, and I will explain why. But what is already interesting to have in mind is that the US administration now has a seat at the table when it comes to the release of these models. That's something completely new, right? I mean, over the past few decades, the US has left US companies being able to go globally. That's what we called also soft power, US soft power, right? And now the Europeans and other regions, some very enthusiastic users of Anthropic are now freaking out because they are like, okay, so it's not up to Anthropic to decide to release a model, but it's up to the US administration. And so that creates a lot of chaos for the potential, the users of the technology, and also for the future release of frontier models, not just for Anthropic, but also for OpenAI and other leading AI labs based in the US.
Thank you. Second question on the DMA. What has been the reactions of the US on the DMA?
Right now, the reaction of the US has been quiet, but there is one thing that we can already have in mind is that Trump has announced a 100% tariff on any country who would create a tech tax. And that is not a direct response to the extension of the DMA on cloud providers in the EU, but it should be read as an indirect response. Why? Because over the past few years and so, the tariff discussion between the EU and the US has been extremely complex due to the US tech companies being seen as indirectly taxed by the EU, and that is related, according to Trump administration, that is related to tech regulation in Europe. And when they target those regulations, they think about DMA, they think about DSA, they think about the EU AI Act. So these regulations really are something that the US administration sees as a tax. And so that is the issue that might come back in the discussion, the tariff discussion between the EU and the US. So the reaction of Trump already, which is not related to DMA, is an indication that the debate is not over on this issue.
Sebastian, thank you so much for that. One of the questions we've received on your policy peers is questions that have been asked several times is, what about open foundation models? Are they dead?
No, they're not. They're not. Open weight models are not dead. At least that is the position of Europe and likely China. And a few players as well in the US who are still considering open weight as a way to release models, not necessarily frontier models, but models that would perform in a more impressive way, but can be very convenient for some uses for companies. So if we just select Europe as a region and how they consider open source for AI, open source is part of the policies that the European Commission is considering right now. It's true for the latest package that they have released a week ago. And we also have Mistral. Mistral is the leading player in Europe when it comes to AI models, and they are leading on an open weight model, right? So No, I think open source still is promising. But at the same time, we can also argue that closed models have their advantages as well. If you think about Anthropic, for example, they argue that their model is so powerful that put in the wrong hands, it could turn out being extremely dangerous. And they are mentioning existential risks, bioweapons, and so on. So the argument for Anthropic of not releasing these models in an open source way is because it would be too dangerous to do it. What is interesting still is even as a closed model, the US administration has at some point decided to ban those frontier models for non-US citizens, which shows that maybe we are reaching right now a tipping point on the question of open source closed models when it comes to existential risks, and that actually governments in the end want to have a say on the release of those models.
So another question that came with the acceleration of adoptions of augmented reality glasses, just like the Meta Ray-Ban and other models released in Europe and worldwide, isn't there a real tension on the current GDPR framework?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, there will be a tension on GDPR for a simple reason is those glasses, they bring super intelligence, I mean AI. And so it's not just a matter of taking photos of your friends with the camera or making a short movie. And the question of bystander, there is already this question, right, of privacy of bystanders, but that's not a very new question. Now really the question is about how do you manage the question of GDPR through the integration of those cameras and the Gen AI that can, with the help of those cameras, make other applications. And so facial recognition, for example, quickly has become an opportunity, but also obviously a huge privacy risk. Because yes, the AI that is embarked on those technologies, on those glasses, they enable these kind of services. I mean, that can be interesting, right? But that also creates the question of consent. How do you get the consent of a person you are having in front of you and you want to know who is this person? It can be in a private event, for example, and you have like people who likely will give their consent, but still the question is not resolved, right, through GDPR. So that's I think a first question. GDPR doesn't provide an answer to this sort of opportunity. We could see it as an opportunity, right? The privacy experts and advocates would probably consider is as a risk anyway, right? But we could imagine use cases where there is a positive impact of the technology regardless. Well, that's a first thing. And then the second question is with superintelligence, you always need cameras. You will need cameras to sort of understand your environment. And it's not just about facial recognition. It's about recognizing a shop, recognizing your environment, and then making sense of that and being able to give you some tailored responses based on that. And here as well, I think we will have an issue because it will be a matter of consent. It will be a matter of making sure that users accept that different services are being used to provide the best experience to the user. And here as well, GDPR doesn't necessarily provide a clear answer to these new services that are emerging. Obviously, a GDPR was not thought for this kind of use cases. So that will pose some questions in the future if we think that those technologies really are getting massively adopted, and if these technology actually end up being equally used as our smartphones, for example.
So another question that comes from your policy peer, Sebastian, is GDPR in Europe really ready for the AI revolution?
Well, Juan, I think that's a good and complex question. It's difficult to respond with an easy answer, but I would say that the, the European Commission has acknowledged the issue of GDPR. And right now, I would say is somehow deciding to not do much. I will explain why. So, in November, in the newsletter I wrote in November, I was analyzing what the European Commission has called the digital omnibus package. And back in November, the idea of the Commission was to make it easier to use data to train AI models. And essentially, one rule the European Commission was ready to consider is to acknowledge that legitimate interest rather than consent is okay to train AI models. I won't get too much into the details of that, but essentially that means that with legitimate interest, you don't need to ask consent for users every time you do something new. Essentially, it is rather making sure that users don't opt out. So essentially, the European Commission has considered legitimate interest back in November as a solution to ease the training of AI models. Essentially, what legitimate interest means is that users have the possibility to opt out, and it's as opposed to the consent, where essentially users opt in. And this change would have enabled the capacity for AI labs to access more data, essentially, potentially sensitive data, in order to train models. That's somehow the direction of travel back in November by the European Commission. Today, the digital omnibus, doesn't really mention that anymore. So, in a sense, they have heard the critics of privacy advocates and have considered that they were going too far, likely. And so right now, to the question of is GDPR ready for the revolution, I would say that we are more in a status quo, where GDPR is likely not going to evolve so much. And that could pose a question mark for the future development of AI models in Europe, obviously. And so the real question now that might represent an issue in Europe is AI labs. Obviously, we can't and will not in the future access to the same level of data that can be accessed outside the EU. So obviously, we are talking about sensitive data that can be medical data, for example, this kind of data. So in Europe, the users' data wouldn't be trained, and somehow that could represent an issue for AI models moving forward. And if they decided to move forward accessing to this kind of data, they would do it, but without European citizens' data, essentially. The issue is super sensitive because we're talking about privacy. And privacy advocates in Europe, not just Europe actually, but are extremely concerned over the question of use of personal data, and in particular when it comes to sensitive data. Well, then, I mean, we are talking about training models. So in a sense, we end up with a form of anonymization of data anyway, right? So that's where I think there is room for accessing this kind of data for data training, because we're only talking about training, and we are talking about millions of data, and it's not just like personal data we're talking about. It's like an aggregation of millions of data. So, and it's kind of like the same issue for copyright. Access to copyright data, right holders are extremely concerned over the use of copyright materials. But that's the same thing. I mean, when you use copyright data in millions and millions and millions of data that you've been using, what is exactly the value of this data? How do you materialize that? And it's not very easy. Is it really a breach for copyright holders? Do they need to get paid for this kind of data? How much? That's, no one really has an answer for that. And so it's really a question of what are we sort of like giving up to AI labs when we give our data, and what can we do with that? So of course, then it brings up the debate over, but should we pay back the people who give data? But I really don't think that it's the right debate, because I think that at an individual level, we sort of give nothing. I mean, even from a copyright perspective, that's my view, but that's personal. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't consider the retribution of right holders, for example. I'm not saying that we should use people's sensitive data. I'm not saying that, but I'm also saying that doing so is not as dangerous as it is presented. But that's and right now it's a status quo. Nothing is happening. I mean, the directive on AI and copyright is likely to be reviewed in the fall by the European Commission. The section really about AI and copyright, and it will be interesting to see how the European Commission moves forward on this issue, because that's a very, very complex one. Mistral already has acknowledged that there should be a retribution for right holders, but doesn't necessarily give elements of how it should be done, but at least acknowledges it, right? And right holders on their side in France, for example, have tried to pass a regulation in France to say, by default, all AI labs should be considered as using copyright data in their data training, and they should give access to right holders to know to what extent it has been done, in order to open up the door for retribution of right holders. So again, the by default, considering by default that AI labs are using copyright data, it goes a little bit far. And right now the regulation has been dropped, but it gives an idea of how right holders wants to address the debate in the fall, when we will have the debate at European level.
So thank you, Sebastian, for those answers. And policy peers, we'll hope that you'll opt in for this new edition. Enjoy the content, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Juan. Please don't hesitate to opt in to the newsletter, to send direct messages and comment on LinkedIn. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to have a question asked over the show.